somewhere beneath the cracked golden earth of Middle Egypt, in a limestone cave carved out by centuries of wind and silence, a book waited. Not for years, not for decades. For over 1,000 years it sat wrapped in its own decay, pressed between layers of stone and sand, while empires rose above it and crumbled again. No one knew it was there. No one came looking. The desert kept its secret the way deserts always do, patiently, indifferently, as if time itself meant nothing to it. And inside that forgotten cave was something extraordinary. A papyrus codex, its pages brittle as dried leaves, its ink faded to the colour of rust and shadow. A text so dangerous to the early Christian world that entire councils of bishops had once condemned it by name, centuries before anyone ever saw its actual words. They knew of it only through rumour, through the furious writings of men trying to stamp it out of existence. And yet here it was, buried, waiting, refusing to disappear entirely. This is the Gospel of Judas, and what it claims, if the scholars who've studied it are right, could quietly undo one of the oldest stories in human history. For nearly 2,000 years, one name has stood for betrayal itself. Judas Iscariot, the disciple who sold his teacher for silver. The kiss that meant death. It's a story so deeply woven into our language that even now, calling someone a Judas needs no explanation at all. But somewhere in this ancient text, in fragile ink on fragile paper, there's a very different version of that night. A version where Judas isn't the villain of the story at all, where he might have been, according to some interpretations, the one disciple who truly understood what Jesus was asking of him, the one entrusted with the hardest task of all. And that's really just the beginning of what makes this buried codex so unsettling. Because tucked inside its pages is something even stranger than a reimagined Judas. A suggestion whispered through cryptic dialogue and cosmic imagery that the physical world we live in, the stars, the mountains, our very bodies, might never have been meant to exist at all. That creation itself, in the eyes of whoever wrote this gospel, may have been something closer to a mistake. We're going to spend the next while unwrapping all of it slowly, piece by piece. The cave where it was found, the black market it passed through, the scientists who raced against time to save it from turning to dust in their hands, the strange, secretive religious movement called Gnosticism that produced it, and the forbidden theology hiding inside its lines. Ideas the early church fought so hard to bury that for over 1,000 years it seemed like they'd actually succeeded. Before we go any further, if you're listening to this to help you drift off, that's exactly what this is here for. So go ahead and follow along on Spotify if that's where you're listening. It's genuinely the easiest way to support what I do here, and there's a link waiting for you in the description whenever you're ready. Costs nothing, helps a lot, and I'd love to know, wherever you are right now, whatever time it happens to be for you, drop it in the comments. I read every single one. It's always strange and wonderful to picture someone in Manila just waking up, someone in Toronto just closing their eyes, someone in Lisbon somewhere in between, all listening to the same slow unravelling of the same ancient mystery. So settle in, let your shoulders drop. There's no rush here tonight. We have a cave to find in the Egyptian sand, and a story that's been waiting over 1,000 years to be told again. Let's go there now. Let's find that cave. The story, as best as anyone can reconstruct it, begins near a town called El Minya, roughly 150 miles south of Cairo, in a stretch of Middle Egypt where the Nile carves a thin green ribbon through an otherwise unforgiving landscape. On either side of that river, the land turns quickly to limestone cliffs and open desert, honeycombed with caves and tombs that have been used and reused for burial since long before Christianity ever existed. It's the kind of terrain where history doesn't erase itself so much as it gets buried, layer upon layer, waiting for wind or water or human hands to expose it again. Sometime in the mid to late 1970s, likely 1976, though even that detail is far from certain, local farmers were reportedly searching that limestone terrain, possibly looking for something as mundane as fertilizer, the mineral-rich soil sometimes found near ancient burial sites. What they found instead, according to the most widely repeated account, was a cave. Not a grand one. Not the kind of dramatic, torch-lit chamber you might picture from an adventure film. Just a modest hollow in the rock, the kind that had likely sheltered the dead for centuries, quiet and forgotten, sealed off from the world above by nothing more than time and sand. Inside that cave, resting among human remains, they say they found a limestone box. And inside that box, wrapped and protected in ways that have never been fully confirmed, was a leather-bound papyrus codex. Not a scroll, but a book in something close to the modern sense. Pages bound together along one edge, covered in Coptic script that none of the men who found it could read. Now, here's where the story gets murky, and it's worth sitting with that murkiness for a moment rather than rushing past it, because unlike so many great archaeological discoveries, ones with careful field notes, photographs and academic oversight from the very first moment of unearthing, this one has almost none of that. There was no excavation team, no scholars standing nearby with notebooks. Just, if the accounts are to be believed, farmers digging in the dry earth, stumbling onto something they couldn't possibly have understood the significance of. Some versions of the story suggest the codex wasn't found alone. It may have been part of a larger cache of ancient texts, other papyrus fragments, other fragile documents, all resting together in that same limestone tomb, as if someone, centuries earlier, had deliberately gathered a small library of forbidden writings and hidden it away from a world that wanted it destroyed. If that's true, and many scholars believe it likely is, then this cave wasn't just a burial site. It may have been something closer to a hiding place, a vault built not from stone and mortar, but from secrecy and sand. Try to picture that moment for a second, the heat of the Egyptian sun pressing down on the cracked earth. The particular kind of silence that exists in deserts, not an absence of sound exactly, but a stillness that seems to swallow sound whole. And then suddenly a shape in the rock, a darker patch of shadow that shouldn't be there. Maybe a shift underfoot, a collapse of soil, revealing an opening that had been sealed for over 1,000 years. Whoever found it first would have had no way of knowing that what they were looking at could someday upend some very old, very deeply held ideas about betrayal, about faith, about the nature of Judas Iscariot himself. To them it would have simply been old, cracked leather, yellowed papyrus that seemed ready to disintegrate at the faintest touch. Words in a script most Egyptians hadn't used in daily life for well over 1,000 years. And that's really the heartbreaking part of this whole story, if you think about it long enough. Because the people who found this codex, whoever they were, however many of them there actually were, had absolutely no way of understanding what they were holding. To them, this wasn't the lost Gospel of Judas. It wasn't a theological bombshell. It was just a strange, brittle old book, found in a hole in the ground, valuable perhaps only in the vague sense that old things sometimes are, something that might be worth a bit of money if the right buyer could be found. Some accounts suggest it sat, quite literally, in someone's home for a while afterward, wrapped in cloth, tucked away in a cupboard or a trunk, treated with about as much reverence as an old family photo album nobody quite knows what to do with. Other versions of the story suggest it was moved almost immediately into networks of antiquities dealers, men who understood at least vaguely that ancient texts could be sold, even if they had no real sense of what this particular one contained, or why it mattered. What we do know, with more confidence than the discovery details themselves, is that this codex wasn't created in isolation. It was written, scholars believe, Sometime in the 3rd or 4th century, likely by Coptic Christian scribes copying from an even older Greek original, one that may have circulated as early as the 2nd century, not long after the earliest canonical Gospels themselves were being written and debated. So by the time it was sealed away in that limestone cave, it had already lived one long life, as a copy of a text that Christian bishops in the early centuries of the Church had specifically named and specifically condemned. Which raises a quiet, almost eerie question that we'll keep circling back to throughout this story. If this text was so dangerous, so thoroughly denounced by the Church Fathers who knew of it, why would anyone go through the trouble of copying it at all, let alone hiding it carefully enough that it survived undisturbed for over 16 centuries? Maybe someone believed in it enough to protect it from destruction. Maybe someone simply couldn't bring themselves to burn a sacred text, even one their church had condemned. We'll likely never know for certain. The desert doesn't explain itself. It simply holds what it's given, indifferent to whether that thing is treasure or heresy, until sometimes centuries later someone happens to dig in just the right place. And that's exactly what happened here. A hole opened in the sand, and something the ancient world had tried very hard to erase quietly slipped back out into the light. What happened to it next, though, is where this story turns from quiet mystery into something far messier. Because once that codex left the desert, it entered a very different kind of wilderness. The black market for stolen antiquities, and that's where we're headed next. Once that codex left the quiet stillness of the limestone cave, it entered a world that had no use for reverence or silence. It entered the antiquities market of Egypt, a shadowy, sprawling network where ancient artifacts are treated not as windows into the human past, but as commodities to be bargained over. This is a world that operates largely in cash, in whispers, and in the grey spaces between local laws and international borders. It's a world where provenance, that vital chain of custody that tells scholars exactly where an object came from and what conditions it survived in, is either inconveniently murky or deliberately obscured. From the moment the codex changed hands from whoever found it to the first middleman, its history began to blur. We don't know the names of the initial dealers. We don't know exactly how much money first crossed palms in those dusty rooms, or what promises, if any, were made about the manuscript's care. What we do know is that it moved quickly through the channels of the Egyptian antiquities trade, passing from one dealer to another, each taking a cut, each perhaps holding it for a few weeks or months, before flipping it to someone with deeper pockets and more international connections. Try to imagine the fragility of this object, a papyrus codex that had rested in the dry, stable environment of a desert cave for over 1600 years, suddenly thrust into the humidity and chaos of modern cities. Unfolded by hands that might not have understood how brittle ancient fibres can be, exposed to city air, to the oils of human skin, to the harsh light of bare bulbs in back rooms, where the only concern was how much it might fetch. By the early 1980s, the Codex had attracted the attention of higher-level dealers who recognized that this wasn't just any ancient manuscript. This was something potentially significant, a complete codex, or near complete, with text that appeared to mention biblical figures. That kind of object doesn't stay in local markets for long. It gets shopped around, and that's exactly what happened. The manuscript was offered to various international buyers, including notably representatives of Yale University, who reportedly examined it and recognized its potential importance. But there was a problem, actually. There were several problems. The asking price was astronomical for the time. Some accounts suggest the dealers were demanding $3 million, an almost unheard of sum for a single manuscript in the early 1980s. Whether that number was a serious asking price or merely an opening gambit in a negotiation meant to establish the object's perceived value, it had the effect of freezing most potential buyers out. Museums and universities operate on budgets and acquisitions committees. They don't typically carry that kind of cash for something with no documented history and uncertain authenticity. So the Codex didn't sell. Not to Yale, not to anyone with the resources and the institutional will to properly conserve it. Instead, it continued its drift through the black market, a drift that eventually carried it across the Atlantic Ocean. By the mid-1980s, the manuscript had found its way to the United States, specifically to a bank in a quiet suburb on Long Island, New York. And there, in a climate-controlled but otherwise completely inappropriate environment, it sat, in a safe deposit box, for over a decade. Think about that for a moment. This extraordinarily fragile document, this text that early church fathers had condemned and someone had carefully hidden in a cave to protect from destruction, spent more than 10 years locked away in a drawer, untouched, unread, and slowly, silently deteriorating. Because here's the thing about ancient papyrus, it doesn't just stay the same. It's organic material, essentially pressed and dried plant fibers. Even in stable conditions, it continues a slow process of degradation. But in less than ideal conditions, that process accelerates dramatically, and a safe deposit box, while secure from thieves, offers none of the careful environmental controls that conservators use to preserve ancient manuscripts. No regulation of humidity, which can cause papyrus to expand and contract, cracking the ink that sits on its surface. No protection from temperature fluctuations, no isolation from the slow, relentless effects of time on material that was never meant to survive this long in the first place. By the time the Codex re-emerged from that Long Island vault, it was in significantly worse condition than when it had gone in. Pages that might have been intact were now fragmented. Text that might have been legible was now obscured by damage. Parts of the manuscript had begun to crumble away entirely, taking their ancient words with them into irretrievable dust, and the situation was about to get even worse. In the late 1990s, the Codex was acquired by an antiquities dealer named Bruce Farini, based in Ohio. Farini was a controversial figure in the rare manuscript world, known for aggressive dealing practices and for treating ancient documents more as financial instruments than as irreplaceable historical artifacts. His handling of the Judas Codex would prove disastrous. Farini reportedly attempted to break up the manuscript, separating pages or fragments, perhaps to sell them individually, a practice that, while potentially more profitable, effectively destroys the integrity of a codex as a unified text. Some fragments were allegedly frozen, a catastrophic decision for papyrus, as the expansion and contraction of moisture within the fibers can shatter ancient ink and split the papyrus itself apart. Other fragments may have been exposed to direct sunlight or harsh artificial light, further bleaching and degrading text that had already survived 16 centuries in darkness. The full extent of the damage inflicted during this period may never be completely known. Scholars who later worked to reconstruct and translate the Gospel of Judas spoke of missing pages, of text that had been reduced to scattered puzzle pieces, of passages that could only be guessed at because the physical evidence had been destroyed by mishandling. What is clear is that the commercial interests surrounding this manuscript very nearly succeeded in doing what 1600 years of burial had not. They very nearly destroyed it completely. A text that had survived the fall of empires, the rise and suppression of heresies, and a millennium and a half in the desert, was almost erased not by time or nature, but by greed. And yet, somehow against considerable odds, the core of the manuscript survived. Damaged, fragmented, incomplete, but still legible in enough places to reveal its extraordinary contents. The story of how it was finally rescued and brought to the attention of the scholarly world is itself a remarkable tale of persistence and care, one that would eventually lead to one of the most significant discoveries in the study of early Christianity. But before we get to that rescue, before we can understand what the Gospel of Judas actually says, and why it matters so much, we need to sit with this uncomfortable truth for a moment longer. That the black market for antiquities doesn't just operate in the shadows of international law. It operates in the shadows of history itself, and sometimes the things it destroys are things we can never get back. By the time serious scholars finally gained access to the Codex, it was no longer a book in any recognizable sense. It was a catastrophe of broken fibers and scattered ink. Imagine taking an ancient, dried leaf, pressing it flat in the dark for 16 centuries, and then crumpling it, freezing it, and leaving it to fragment in a bank vault. That is what the rescuers faced. The papyrus pages, which had once been bound together in a manageable codex, had shattered into thousands of tiny pieces. Some fragments were no larger than a fingernail. Others had crumbled into mere dust, taking their ancient words into oblivion. The iron gall ink, once carefully painted onto the page by a scribe in the quiet of some ancient scriptorium, was now sitting on the surface of the papyrus like tiny, precarious scabs ready to flake away at the slightest vibration or breath. In many places the damage was so severe that the text was simply gone, leaving only ghostly voids where words and sentences should have been. This wasn't just a manuscript in need of repair. It was an ancient voice on the very edge of permanent silence. But against all odds, that voice was about to find its champions. In the late 1990s, the fractured remnants of the Codex were acquired by the Maecenas Foundation for Ancient Art, a Swiss organization dedicated to the preservation and study of antiquities. Under the guidance of Foundation Director Mario Roberti, the Codex was finally removed from the destructive currents of the commercial market and brought into the light of scholarly care. But the Maecenas Foundation knew that rescue required more than good intentions. It required resources, expertise, and an institutional commitment on a massive scale. Enter the National Geographic Society. In the early 2000s, National Geographic partnered with the Maecenas Foundation and the Waite Institute for Historical Discovery, providing the funding and the global platform necessary to tackle what had become one of the most complex conservation projects in the history of ancient manuscripts. It was a partnership born of urgency. Every day that passed without intervention, more of the text crumbled away. The physical restoration of the Codex was an exercise in extraordinary patience and precision. The team, led by master conservator Coptic scholars and papyrus experts, couldn't simply flip the pages and smooth out the wrinkles. There were no pages left. Instead, they had to work with the fragmented debris, a chaotic jigsaw puzzle of ancient plant fibre with no picture on the box to guide them. The first and most critical step was stabilization. The fragments were incredibly fragile, their cellular structure compromised by centuries of degradation and decades of modern mistreatment. Simply touching them could cause them to disintegrate. Conservators placed the fragments between sheets of glass, creating a stable, humidified microclimate that prevented further cracking and flaking. This technique, simple in concept but agonizingly delicate in execution, allowed the ink to settle and the fibers to relax, halting the relentless process of decay. Then came the reassembly. Try to imagine sitting at a table with thousands of irregularly shaped pieces of a puzzle, all of them the same brownish colour, all of them incredibly brittle. Now imagine that the pieces are curved and warped, and that the image you are trying to reconstruct is text written in an ancient language, and that many of the pieces are missing entirely. This was the daily reality for the team. They worked under magnification, using tweezers and tiny implements, matching the direction of the papyrus fibers, the patterns of insect damage, and the spacing of the Coptic letters to piece together lines, then paragraphs, then entire pages. A single page might take weeks or even months to reconstruct, and some passages remained permanently lost, obliterated by the years of mishandling. But slowly, painstakingly, the shattered codex began to take shape again, revealing columns of text that had not been read by human eyes in over 1600 years. As the physical reconstruction inched forward, another kind of detective work was happening in parallel. Before anyone could trust the words emerging from these reassembled fragments, they had to be certain of one thing. Was this manuscript actually ancient? In the world of antiquities, where fortunes are made and reputations are destroyed, forgeries do exist. And a text claiming to be the lost Gospel of Judas would be an incredibly tempting target for a skilled forger. So the team turned to science. They sent tiny samples of the papyrus and of the ink to independent laboratories for radiocarbon dating. The results were illuminating. The tests placed the physical creation of the Codex somewhere around 280 CE, with a margin of error of roughly plus or minus 60 years. This meant the manuscript was produced in the late 3rd or early 4th century, exactly the time period when we would expect a Coptic translation of a 2nd century Greek text to have been made. The ink analysis confirmed the use of iron gall ink, consistent with ancient scribal practices, and found no trace of modern chemicals or pigments. But the scientific authentication didn't stop at carbon dating. Scholars examined the linguistic features of the text, analysing the specific dialect of Coptic used, the grammatical constructions, and the vocabulary. They found a dialect known as Sahidic, the standard literary Coptic of that era, mixed with subtle idiosyncrasies that suggested a living, breathing scribe, translating from a Greek original, not a modern forger attempting to mimic an ancient language. The cumulative weight of the evidence, the radiocarbon dates, the ink composition, the linguistic analysis, the codicology of the binding, all pointed to the same conclusion. This was genuine. This was a real ancient manuscript, rescued from the very brink of destruction. The story of the Codex's salvation is, in its own way, as remarkable as the text itself. It is a testament to what meticulous care and scientific rigour can achieve, even when confronted with the worst kinds of neglect. An object that had been buried, ignored, exploited and shattered was finally being treated with the reverence it deserved. The fragments had been stabilised, the text was being reconstructed, the dating had been confirmed. Everything was now in place for a revelation that would send shockwaves through the world of biblical scholarship and beyond. But before we can explore what the Gospel of Judas actually says, before we can wrestle with its radical reimagining of the most infamous betrayal in history, we need to understand the intellectual world that produced it, a world that was far stranger and far more diverse than many people realise. On an April morning in 2006, the world was invited to witness something it had not seen in nearly 2 millennia. In a packed press conference in Washington, D.C., the National Geographic Society prepared to unveil a ghost. The room hummed with a quiet, electric anticipation. Journalists, scholars, and theologians from around the globe gathered, or tuned in to the live broadcast, waiting to hear the voice of a man who had been silenced by history for over 1600 years. When the lights dimmed and the first reconstructed images of the ancient papyrus appeared on the screens, a tangible shift moved through the room. The Gospel of Judas was no longer a rumour, no longer a crumbling secret hidden away in a bank vault, or a name dropped cautiously in academic footnotes. It was real, and it was about to speak. The global reaction was swift and overwhelming. Within hours, the story had leaped from the quiet corridors of antiquities scholarship to the front pages of every major newspaper on Earth. television broadcasts interrupted their regular programming. The Internet, still expanding its reach in the mid-2000s, became a vast humming forum of debate and wonder. The idea of a new ancient gospel, a text that had somehow survived the centuries against impossible odds, tapped into a deep, almost primal fascination. For centuries the name Judas Iscariot had been synonymous with treason, the ultimate archetype of the betrayer. He was the villain of the Christian narrative, the man who sold the Son of God for 30 pieces of silver. And now, here was an ancient text, authenticated by the highest scientific standards, claiming to tell a radically different story. The headline that echoed across the world was intoxicating. Judas was not the betrayer, but the hero, the beloved disciple, the only one who truly understood. This sensational framing was fueled in no small part by the initial translation choices presented at the press conference. The team of scholars working on the Codex had done extraordinary work piecing together a text from thousands of fragments, and their initial readings highlighted the most dramatic passages. In the reconstructed Coptic text, Jesus looks at Judas and tells him that he will exceed all the other disciples, for he will sacrifice the man that clothes him. In this reading, Judas's act of handing Jesus over to the authorities was not a vicious betrayal, but a courageous, necessary fulfillment of a secret command. Jesus wanted to escape the prison of his physical body, and only Judas understood this. The press conference emphasized this dramatic inversion, and the world latched onto it. It was a perfect narrative, a reversal that challenged 2,000 years of established belief. The excitement was palpable, a collective gasp of historical revelation that rippled outward through the cultural consciousness. But in the hushed halls of academia, not everyone was ready to uncork the champagne. As the initial media frenzy reached a fever pitch, a counter-melody of scholarly skepticism began to emerge. Some experts voiced concerns that the interpretation presented at the press conference was, if not outright incorrect, then at least dangerously oversimplified. The rush to present a clean, compelling narrative to the public had, they argued, smoothed over the jagged, ambiguous edges of an incredibly complex and fragmentary text. Certain scholars pointed to problematic readings of key Coptic words, suggesting that the translation choices made Judas's role seem more heroic than the ancient grammar truly supported. Others noted that the National Geographic team had been working under an intense deadline, driven by the demands of a massive media rollout, and that such pressure was not always the best companion to meticulous philology. The fragmentary nature of the Codex meant that many key sentences were missing vital words, and in their initial translations the team had sometimes filled these gaps with assumptions that leaned toward the sensational. The debate over these early translations would simmer for years, reminding the world that ancient texts rarely yield their secrets easily, and that the space between a fragmented line of Coptic and an English headline is vast, fraught, and heavily shaded by interpretation. Yet even amid the debates over translation and presentation, something much larger had been ignited. The announcement of the Gospel of Judas did far more than challenge a single biblical villain. It reignited a profound and widespread interest in the sheer, staggering diversity of early Christianity. For a general public largely familiar with a single unified narrative of the faith's origins, the revelation of this text was a doorway into a lost world. A world where the definition of what it meant to follow Jesus was not settled, but hotly contested. A world where dozens of different communities scattered across the Mediterranean and the Near East told wildly different stories about who Jesus was, what he taught, and how salvation could be achieved. The Gospel of Judas was a vivid, tangible proof that the early Christian movement was not a monolith, but a sprawling, chaotic, brilliantly diverse ecosystem of beliefs. It forced a deeper question into the public consciousness. If a gospel could be written that cast Judas as the hero, what other strange and beautiful theologies had been lost to time, suppressed, or deliberately forgotten? The announcement had cracked open the ancient earth, letting a strange and intoxicating light pour out from a buried past. But the text itself was far stranger, and far more challenging, than the simple story of a redeemed betrayer that had initially captured the world's attention. The public had been mesmerized by the idea of Judas the hero But the actual theological landscape of the Gospel was far more disorienting, a landscape that questioned the very foundations of the world itself. To truly understand what the Gospel of Judas was saying, to hear the actual voice whispering from those reassembled fragments of ancient papyrus, we must step deeper into the mind of the scribes who wrote it. We must enter the shadowy philosophical world of the Gnostics, a world where the creator of the universe was not the true God, and where the material world we inhabit was born from a cosmic error. To step into the world of the Gnostics is to step into a vision of reality that feels entirely upside down. Imagine looking out at the vast ancient desert landscape, the same desert where these texts were hidden, the endless miles of rock and sand, the burning sun, the physical world in all its harsh, undeniable presence. Now imagine being told that none of it is truly real, that it is, at best, a kind of cosmic prison, a flawed and suffocating illusion crafted by an ignorant or malicious builder. This was the foundational, radical claim of Gnosticism. It was not a single organized religion with a strict hierarchy and a unified rulebook. Rather, it was a sprawling, shifting constellation of spiritual movements that bloomed across the Mediterranean and Near East during the early centuries of the Common Era. These movements shared a common, intoxicating focus, the pursuit of gnosis. Gnosis is a Greek word that simply means knowledge. But the kind of knowledge the Gnostics sought was not the sort you could find by studying the stars or debating in a marketplace. It was not intellectual or academic. It was intimate, revelatory, and deeply personal. Scholars believe gnosis was understood as a direct, illuminating encounter with the divine, a sudden awakening that pierced through the veil of everyday existence. For the Gnostics, salvation did not come through faith alone, through obedience to religious laws, or through the rituals of an established priesthood. The emerging mainstream Christian church was building its foundations on faith, on trusting in the unseen, on adhering to shared creeds and communal worship. But the Gnostics believed that faith was only a preliminary step, a shadow of the truth. It was gnosis, secret, transformative, experiential knowledge that could wake the sleeper from the nightmare of the material world and return them to their true home. At the heart of this pursuit lay a profound and disorienting dualism. The Gnostics looked around at the world and saw suffering, decay, and death. They saw children starving, diseases ravaging communities, the relentless cruelty of the elements. They asked a question that has haunted philosophers and theologians for millennia. If the true God is perfectly good, purely light, and infinitely wise, how could such a God have created a world so full of pain and imperfection? The Gnostic answer was both simple and devastating. The true God did not create this world. According to most Gnostic cosmologies, the true divine realm, the pleroma or fullness, exists far beyond the physical universe. It is a realm of pure spirit, of blinding, unimaginable light, where the true God resides in eternal, silent perfection, uncontacted by matter. This world, the world of flesh and bone, of dust and rust and dying stars, was the work of a lesser being. Some interpretations suggest this being was born from a cosmic error, a kind of tragic misstep within the divine realm itself. This being, often called the Demiurge, was ignorant of the true God above. Believing itself to be the ultimate creator and demanding worship, it shaped the material cosmos as a flawed reflection of the spiritual truth. In some texts, this demiurge is portrayed not just as ignorant, but as malevolent, a jealous archon, a cosmic jailer intent on keeping humanity trapped in the illusion of matter. But if the material world is a prison, how did we end up here? And more importantly, how do we escape? The Gnostics told a story of a primordial catastrophe. They believed that fragments of the divine, tiny sparks of the pure light from the true realm above, had become entrapped within physical bodies. The human being in the Gnostic view is a walking paradox, a fragile shell of decaying matter housing an immortal divine spark that has forgotten its true origin. The material world, with its seductions and its sufferings, is designed to keep that spark asleep. Every physical desire, every attachment to the things of this world acts as a shackle. Sleepwalking through life, humanity remains blind to its own nature. Only Gnosis can shatter the spell. When the spark is awakened by secret, revealed knowledge, it remembers where it came from. It recognizes the material world for the cage it is, and it begins the long, difficult journey back to the pleroma, back to the true God. This was not, it is thought, a single, unified school of thought. The diversity of Gnostic sects and texts is staggering. In the sands of Egypt, particularly in the extraordinary cache of manuscripts discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945, scholars have uncovered a vast library of Gnostic writings. There are Sethian texts which trace the lineage of the divine spark through the biblical figure of Seth, the third son of Adam and Eve. There are Valentinian texts, followers of the philosopher Valentinus, who wove incredibly intricate, almost poetic cosmologies describing the fall and restoration of the divine. There are writings associated with Simon Magus and Basilides, and a dozen other teachers whose names have been largely erased by history. Some sects believed in radical asceticism, denying the flesh entirely in an attempt to starve the material body and liberate the spirit. Others took the opposite approach, reasoning that since the body was merely a worthless prison, what one did with it did not matter, and they engaged in elaborate rituals that deliberately transgressed social and moral norms. There was no single Gnostic Bible, no pope, no central authority dictating correct belief. There were only teachers' texts and the elusive individual search for awakening. It is easy to see why these ideas were seen as profoundly dangerous by the emerging church authorities. As the 2nd and 3rd centuries unfolded, Orthodox Christian bishops like Irenaeus of Lyon were fighting to define a single, cohesive body of belief for the Christian movement. They were building an institution, and institutions require order, continuity, and shared dogma. Gnosticism struck at the very foundations of that project. If the God of the Old Testament was merely an ignorant demiurge, then the entire narrative of creation, the covenant, and the law was built on a cosmic deception. If the material world was intrinsically evil, then the doctrine of the resurrection of the body became meaningless, even abhorrent. If salvation could only be achieved through secret, private knowledge, then the authority of the bishops, the sacraments of the church, and the communal life of the faithful were stripped of their power. The Gnostics were not just heretics, they were dismantling the very architecture of the Christian worldview. The Orthodox response was furious, unrelenting, and ultimately victorious. Treatise after treatise was written to expose and demolish the Gnostic heresies, branding their teachers as liars and their texts as poison. It is within this vast, swirling, and fiercely contested world of secret knowledge and cosmic dualism that the Gospel of Judas must be understood. The text found in the Crumbling Codex is not an isolated anomaly. It is an echo of a much larger, much more radical tradition. When we read its ancient ink-stained pages, we are listening to the voice of a community that believed it had penetrated the deepest secret of the universe, that the world around them was a mistake, and that the true path to God lay not in obedience to its Creator, but in escaping Him entirely. And in that light, the figure of Judas, the man who handed over the physical body of Jesus, begins to take on a very different shape. It is tempting to imagine the early centuries of the Christian movement as a time of profound unity, a golden age of shared belief where all followers of Jesus understood his message in exactly the same way. But the historical reality was far more fluid, far more fragmented, and infinitely more fascinating. In the 1st and 2nd centuries, There was no single bound book called the New Testament. There was no universally agreed upon list of sacred texts, no fixed canon that could be distributed to growing communities and read aloud from a pulpit. Instead, the teachings of Jesus circulated as a living, breathing stream of oral traditions, whispered in house churches, debated in marketplaces, and eventually committed to papyrus by dozens of different hands. What we think of today as Christianity was not a single river, but a vast, shifting delta of competing streams. Imagine the ancient landscapes of the Mediterranean, the dusty roads connecting Alexandria to Antioch, the sea lanes carrying merchants and ideas to Rome and beyond. Along those same routes, stories of a Galilean healer and teacher were travelling, mutating, and taking root in vastly different soils. In one city, a community might treasure a collection of Jesus' secret sayings, written down on a scroll and read only to the initiated. In another, a group might focus almost entirely on his death and resurrection, weaving elaborate theological meanings into the narrative of his final days. And in yet another, a teacher might claim to have received a private revelation directly from the risen Christ, a revelation that contradicted everything the neighbouring community believed. The air of the ancient world was thick with these competing voices, and for a long time, no single voice held the authority to silence the rest. Scholars believe that during this period, the sheer volume of texts claiming to carry the authentic voice of Jesus was staggering. Long before church leaders sat down to decide which books were scripture and which were not, communities were writing and sharing their own Gospels. The Gospel of Thomas, discovered along with other ancient manuscripts in the sands of Egypt, is a remarkable example. It contains no narrative of Jesus' birth, no miracles, no crucifixion, and no resurrection. Instead, it is simply a collection of over 100 secret sayings attributed to Jesus, many of which begin with the phrase, "Jesus said." It reads almost like a manual of wisdom, a text designed not to tell a story, but to spark the exact kind of sudden interior awakening the Gnostics sought. Then there is the Gospel of Philip, another text that speaks of sacraments, of the bridging of the spiritual and the material, and of a deep, almost mystical intimacy between Jesus and a figure identified as Mary Magdalene. These were not obscure footnotes. For the communities that cherished them, they were scripture. They were the literal words of life. These different communities held radically different views of who Jesus was and what he had come to do. Some believed he was entirely divine, a pure spirit who only appeared to have a physical body, untouched by the corruption of the material world. Others believed he was a human being who was adopted by God at his baptism, filled with the divine spirit for a time before that spirit departed on the cross. Still others believed he was a cosmic redeemer who had descended from the highest heaven, passing through the spheres of the planets, each governed by a hostile archon, to bring the secret knowledge of humanity's true origin to the souls trapped in the deep sleep of the world. Each of these views generated its own texts, its own rituals, and its own understanding of salvation. There was no central office to issue a ruling, no global council to settle the disputes. There were only small communities, huddled in the flickering lamplight of their meeting places, reading their fragile scrolls and trying to make sense of a mystery that defied easy explanation. The gradual process by which orthodoxy and heresy became defined was not a single event, but a slow, often painful evolution that stretched across centuries. It was driven by the practical need for cohesion and the deep desire to protect a shared identity in a hostile world. As the first generation of apostles began to die, the question of how to preserve the authentic teaching became urgent. Communities started to value texts that could be traced back to apostolic authority, texts that were widely read and accepted across many different regions. Leaders like Irenaeus of Lyon began to argue forcefully for a single fourfold gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, as the definitive and complete record of Jesus' life and teaching. Irenaeus famously declared that there could be neither more nor fewer than 4 Gospels, just as there are 4 cardinal directions and 4 winds. It was a powerful poetic argument, but it was also a political one. It was designed to draw a sharp, unmistakable line between the true universal church and the fractious esoteric sects that threatened to pull the movement apart. It was in this charged and increasingly polarized atmosphere that the label of heresy began to be applied with devastating effect. The word itself simply means choice, but in the hands of the Orthodox bishops it became a weapon. Texts that did not conform to the emerging consensus were not merely rejected, they were denounced as dangerous distortions, the work of false teachers led astray by deceitful spirits. The true church, the argument went, was one, holy, and universal. It spoke with a single voice and taught a single creed. Anything that deviated from that creed was, by definition, a tearing of the body of Christ. Over time, the 4 canonical Gospels were elevated to the status of unquestioned scripture. The others were suppressed, their copies destroyed, their teachings forgotten, buried literally and figuratively beneath the weight of an institutional authority that would not tolerate dissent. It is into this contested, fiercely debated landscape of belief that the Gospel of Judas fits. It is not an isolated anomaly, a strange and inexplicable aberration in an otherwise clean and orderly history. It is, rather, a surviving fragment of the world that was lost, a direct echo of the voices that were silenced. The text found in that crumbling Codex is a product of the same swirling, creative, and combative environment that produced the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Philip. It is the work of a community that had its own distinct understanding of Jesus' mission, and its own fierce conviction that it possessed the true, secret revelation. But what exactly made this text so dangerous? What did it say that provoked the Orthodox Fathers to condemn it by name, to attack it with a fury usually reserved for the worst enemies of the faith? The answer lies in the astonishing, unsettling story it tells, a story that takes the most reviled figure in all of Christian history and completely inverts his role. To understand the true scandal of the Gospel of Judas, we must now open those ancient ink-stained pages and listen carefully to the voice of the text itself. When we finally open the brittle, ink-stained pages of the Gospel of Judas, we do not find the familiar, sweeping narratives of the New Testament. There are no shepherds watching their flocks by night, no winding journeys through the Galilean hills, no detailed accounts of miraculous feedings or healings by the shores of a vast lake. Instead, the text unfolds in a very different key. It presents itself as a dialogue, a whispered, intimate exchange between Jesus and his disciples that takes place during the final, fateful days before the crucifixion. But it is a dialogue charged with a strange and heavy tension, a profound disconnect between the teacher and his followers that sets the entire manuscript on its radical course. The setting is deliberately claustrophobic. Scholars believe the text places this conversation just a few days before the Passover, a time when the shadow of the cross is already falling heavily across the narrative. But rather than gathering all his followers for a unified farewell, the text employs a very specific narrative device. It stages a series of secret conversations, private revelations held apart from the 12. We are told that Jesus withdraws from the larger group, taking only a select few, or sometimes, ultimately just one, into his confidence. This is not the Jesus who preaches to the multitudes from a mountainside. This is a teacher who looks out at the crowds and finds them unready, a master withholding his most profound truths from the very people who think they know him best. The atmosphere is hushed and exclusive, as if the text itself is drawing the ancient reader into a private room, sealing the door against the noise of the conventional world and saying, "Listen, this is what they do not understand, and the tone of what they hear is esoteric, symbolic, and deliberately cryptic. The language does not flow in the simple, earthy parables of mustard seeds and sown fields. Instead, it spirals into visions of cosmic realms, hierarchies of angels, and the hidden origins of the universe. It speaks in riddles and abstractions, a vocabulary carefully designed not to explain, but to awaken. To the uninitiated, the words must have sounded like madness, a labyrinth of strange names and unintelligible pronouncements. But to the community that cherished this text, it is thought that this very obscurity was a sign of its truth. The divine, they believed, could not be spoken of in plain terms. The ultimate reality was too vast, too alien to the normal human mind, to be captured in straightforward propositions. It had to be approached obliquely through symbols that would shatter ordinary perception and force the listener to see the world entirely upside down. This upside-down vision is announced with one of the most striking and unsettling images in the entire Codex. In the opening scenes, the disciples come to Jesus and they are praying. They are doing what any pious, first-century Jew would do. They are giving thanks, offering their devotion, seeking the blessing of the God who created the heavens and the earth. And Jesus laughs. It is not a warm, affectionate chuckle, nor a laugh of joy. It is a laugh of bitter, cosmic irony. He looks at his own chosen followers, the men who are supposed to carry his message to the world, and he laughs at the very act of their worship. Imagine the scene in that dimly lit room. The disciples are on their knees, heads bowed, voices raised in solemn prayer. And the man they call master is standing among them, laughing. They are confused, perhaps even angered. "Why are you laughing at our prayer?" they ask. And the answer he gives shatters the foundations of their entire religious life. He tells them they are not praying to the true God. They are praying to the creator of this world, to the Demiurge, the lesser divine being who shaped the flawed, suffering-filled material realm and mistakenly believed himself to be the ultimate authority. Their prayers, their sacrifices, their pious devotion, all of it is directed at a cosmic impostor, a blind and arrogant ruler who traps souls in flesh and demands worship. Every time they bow their heads, they are deepening their own imprisonment. This laughter is the key to understanding the entire text. It is a devastating critique of conventional religious practice. It strips away the comfort of ritual and tradition, revealing them not as bridges to the divine, but as walls that keep the soul locked in ignorance. The God of the temple, the God of the law, the God of the harvest and the battlefield. This is not the God of Jesus in the Gospel of Judas. The true divine realm the text will go on to reveal is infinitely far above this world, untouched by its violence and corruption, a place of pure light that the creator of this world cannot even comprehend, let alone rule over. To pray to the Creator is to affirm the goodness of a prison. It is to mistake the bars for the sky. And Jesus laughs because the tragedy is so immense, the error so complete, that it has crossed over into absurdity. But if the 12 are trapped in this profound error, if their prayers are a testament to their spiritual blindness, then who can possibly understand? This is the question that haunts the early sections of the text, and it sets the stage for the special relationship between Jesus and Judas that the Codex will explore. Among all the disciples, Judas alone seems to perceive the terrible truth of Jesus' laughter. While the others react with confusion or defensive piety, Judas steps forward. He does not simply accept the old ways. He is somehow able to see beyond the veil. He recognizes that Jesus has come from a realm far above this flawed creation, and he dares to speak the truth that the others cannot bear to hear. "You have come from the immortal realm," Judas tells him, "and you are not of this world." In the economy of this text, this makes Judas unique. He is not the betrayer who hands over his master for 30 pieces of silver. He is the only disciple who truly knows who Jesus is. And it is this knowledge, this spark of recognition in a world shrouded in sleep, that qualifies him to receive the secret revelation. Jesus pulls him aside, away from the 11, and begins to unfold the mysteries of the universe. The dialogue shifts from confrontation to instruction, from the public laughter at the disciples' ignorance to the private sharing of a cosmic secret. What exactly is that secret? What does Jesus tell Judas in the hidden hours of their final conversation? The answers buried in the Crumbling papyrus are more astonishing than anything the Orthodox Church Fathers could have imagined, and they lead directly into the heart of the text's most explosive claim, that the world itself was born from a mistake. And so we arrive at the heart of the reversal, the astonishing pivot upon which the entire Gospel of Judas turns. In the canonical texts of the New Testament, the name Judas Iscariot is synonymous with treachery. It is a name that has echoed through 2 millennia as the ultimate symbol of betrayal. The friend who sells out his master for a bag of silver, the villain who seals his fate with a kiss in the dark of an olive grove. But in the brittle, ink-stained pages of this ancient codex, the shadows shift. The familiar silhouette of the traitor dissolves, and in its place emerges a figure of profound, almost tragic, spiritual heroism. Here, Judas is not the villain of the story. He is the only one who truly understands it. To grasp the sheer magnitude of this reimagination, we have to feel the weight of the traditional narrative. For centuries, the story of Judas has been a cornerstone of Christian theology, a stark morality tale about the depths of human greed and the consequences of turning against the divine. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John depict a man possessed by dark motives, a thief who steals from the common purse, a disillusioned follower who hands Jesus over to the authorities out of spite or satanic influence. His very name became a curse. In the medieval world, the image of Judas with his red hair and his 30 pieces of silver fueled waves of terrible persecution. He was the arch-betrayer, the enemy within, the man who looked the Son of God in the eye and sold him to his death. But the community that cherished the Gospel of Judas looked at this same story and saw a profound misunderstanding. They believed the conventional reading was a surface illusion, a misinterpretation of a sacred and deeply painful act. In this text, Judas is the disciple who sees beyond the veil of the material world, while the other 11 are on their knees, praying earnestly to the creator of this flawed realm. Judas stands apart. He is the only one who recognizes that Jesus has come from a place of pure light, far above the reach of the blind Demiurge who built this cosmic prison. When Judas tells Jesus, "I know who you are and where you have come from," he is not making a simple statement of faith. He is demonstrating a level of spiritual gnosis, a direct experiential knowledge of the divine that the others cannot even fathom. Jesus acknowledges this openly. In one of the most striking lines in the Codex, he tells Judas, "You will exceed all of them. You will sacrifice the man that clothes me." This is not the language of condemnation. This is the language of profound, terrible commissioning. But what does it mean to sacrifice the man that clothes me? This is where the text plunges into its most radical and debated territory. Scholars believe that in the theological framework of this gospel, the physical body is not a sacred vessel. It is a garment, a shell, a heavy, suffocating wrap of matter that traps the divine spark of the true spirit. Jesus, the eternal bringer of light, is encased in this mortal flesh, and he cannot return to the immortal realm until the flesh is shed. His mission on earth is not to establish a kingdom, not to suffer as a ransom for sin in the traditional Orthodox sense, but to deliver the secret knowledge of the true God and then escape the material prison. But the breaking of the prison requires a key, and that key in this narrative is Judas. This brings us to the staggering theological weight of the idea that Jesus asked Judas to hand him over. In the canonical Gospels, the betrayal is a crime of free will, a malicious choice made by a corrupt heart. But in the Gospel of Judas, the handing over is a collaborative act, a dark and agonizing necessity orchestrated by the Master himself. Jesus needs someone to deliver him to the authorities. He needs the mortal shell to be destroyed so the spirit can ascend, and he cannot entrust this task to just anyone. The other disciples are too asleep, too entangled in the illusions of the world, too devoted to their prayers to the lesser God. If they were to hand Jesus over, it would be an act of violence, a genuine betrayal born of ignorance. Only Judas understands the true nature of the sacrifice. Only Judas sees that the death of the body is not an end, but a liberation. Therefore the handing over becomes not an act of treachery, but an act of supreme obedience. It is the ultimate test of discipleship, a devastating burden that only the most enlightened follower can bear. Some interpretations suggest that Judas's act is one of profound, self-sacrificing love. He knows that by doing what Jesus asks, he will be cursed by history. He knows that the other disciples, blind to the true meaning of the event, will despise him. He knows that his name will become a byword for evil across the ages. But he does it anyway, because his Master has asked it of him, and because he alone comprehends the cosmic necessity of releasing the divine spark from its fleshly tomb. Imagine the lonely weight of that knowledge, to hold the key to the world's salvation in your hands, and to know that using it will damn you in the eyes of everyone you love. It is a role that requires a willingness to be misunderstood for eternity, a kind of spiritual martyrdom far more agonizing than any physical death. In this reading, Judas is not the enemy of the Christ. He is the only friend strong enough to help him escape. But scholarly interpretations of this text are not monolithic, and the nuances of the Coptic language invite fierce debate. Some researchers argue that the Gospel does not entirely absolve Judas of a kind of moral stain. They point to passages where Jesus warns Judas that he will be ruled by the 13th demon, suggesting that even this enlightened disciple is not entirely free from the corrupting influence of the lower realms. In this view, Judas is a tragic liminal figure, caught between the higher divine reality and the base matter of the world. He is uniquely qualified to see the truth, but he is still bound in some measure to the flawed creation. He fulfills his necessary role, but he does not ascend to the highest heaven alongside the Christ. Instead, some scholars believe the text implies he will dwell in a kind of intermediate realm, honoured for his knowledge, but marked by the gravity of his earthly actions. It is a more complicated, less triumphant portrait than simple vindication, a figure who bears the awful responsibility of freeing the divine at a terrible personal cost. Yet even with these contested readings, the radical reversal remains undeniable. The Gospel of Judas takes the most despised figure in Christian tradition and transforms him into the central pivot of salvation history. It inverts the moral architecture of the familiar biblical narrative. Good and evil are not what they seem. The betrayer is the saviour. The kiss in the garden is not a mark of deceit, but the final agonized seal on a secret pact of liberation. The worldly authorities who think they are executing a heretic are actually unwitting agents in the grand design of the true God, breaking the chains of matter so the spirit can fly free. By turning the story inside out, the text forces its readers to question the very nature of their reality. If the world was made by a flawed and ignorant creator, then the values of this world are inherently suspect. Success is failure, power is blindness, and the greatest act of love might look to the uninitiated like the ultimate betrayal. This complete inversion of expectation, this shattering of the cosmic mirror, prepares us for the deepest and most esoteric layers of the text. For to understand why Judas must free the spirit from the flesh, we must understand the true origins of the flesh itself and the nature of the prison that the Creator built. And so we arrive at the most esoteric and breathtaking passage in the entire Codex, the moment when the private teachings of Jesus culminate in a staggering vision of the cosmos. Having established that Judas alone recognizes the true origin of the Christ, the text shifts from dialogue to pure, unbridled mystical revelation. Jesus takes Judas aside, away from the sleeping, uncomprehending masses, and opens the doors of perception. He speaks of things never uttered to the other 11, secrets reserved for the one who has proven himself capable of bearing their immense crushing weight. This is not a parable told to a crowd by the seaside. This is a private tour of the highest heavens, whispered in the quiet of the night to a single isolated soul. The text describes Jesus beginning to reveal the mysteries of the supreme divine realm, a place so far removed from the flawed, material world of the Demiurge that human language almost breaks apart trying to describe it. Jesus speaks of an infinite, unnameable expanse, a pure and perfect light that existed long before the blind Creator God ever fashioned the coarse dust of the earth. He explains the complex hierarchy of the heavens, the emanations of divine beings, the luminous aeons that stretch outward from the great invisible spirit-like ripples from a stone dropped into a cosmic ocean. It is a dizzying, intricate cosmology, a map of the true reality hidden behind the crude, painted backdrop of the physical world. And at the center of this map, at the very heart of the revelation, Jesus imparts the ultimate secret, the origin of the divine spark, that fragment of the true God trapped within the prison of human flesh. Then the text takes a dramatic, deeply atmospheric turn. Jesus invites Judas to look up, to step outside the narrow confines of his mortal senses, and behold the true spiritual realm. Some translations of this heavily damaged section describe Judas entering a trance, his consciousness lifted out of the heavy, suffocating gravity of the material plane. And what he sees is not a world of stone and wood and suffering, but a vision of overwhelming alien light. He beholds a luminous cloud, a radiant, shifting expanse of brilliance that rolls across the heavens. From within this cloud, a voice thunders, not the harsh commanding voice of the God who demands sacrifice and obedience, but a voice of profound ancient serenity. Out of the luminous cloud steps a figure of unimaginable brightness, an emanation of the highest divine realm. The text uses fragmented poetic language to capture this moment, describing the vision of a great self-generated angel, an autonomous being of pure light who dwells in the presence of the invisible spirit. The significance of this luminous cloud cannot be overstated, and it is thought by scholars to be one of the most vital keys to understanding the text. In the landscape of ancient Gnostic thought, clouds, and especially clouds of light, are not meteorological phenomena. They are the boundary markers of the divine. A luminous cloud represents the threshold between the flawed, lower realms of matter, where the Demiurge rules, and the perfect, immaterial realms of the true God. To see the luminous cloud is to see the veil parting. It is to witness the light of the true homeland bleeding through the prison walls. For Judas, standing in the dust of the earth with his mind temporarily unfettered, this vision is a confirmation of everything he has intuited. It is the visual proof that the material cosmos is a cage, and that beyond the sky of this world lies a realm of pure, untainted light, the true origin of the Spirit. This cosmic vision sets Judas apart from the other disciples in a way that is absolute and unbridgeable. Throughout the earlier portions of the text, the other 11 are depicted as well-meaning but fundamentally blind. They have dreams and disturbing visions, but when they report them to Jesus, he rebukes them. He tells them their visions are rooted in the lower realms, planted in their minds by the archons, the demonic rulers who govern the material sphere. They are looking inward to the flesh or downward to the earth, and their spiritual sight is hopelessly entangled in the illusions of the Demiurge. But when Judas reports his vision, Jesus does not rebuke him. He weeps. He weeps not from sorrow, but from the profound relief of finally being understood. The luminous cloud is the ultimate dividing line. The other disciples see the creations of the flawed God and worship them. Judas sees past the creation entirely, peering through the cosmic architecture to the light of the true Creator beyond. He has looked into the heart of the divine and returned with a knowledge that makes him an alien among his own kind. This brings us to a central recurring theme in the Gospel of Judas, and indeed in much of Gnostic literature, the idea of hidden wisdom reserved exclusively for the spiritually prepared. The text operates on a framework of layered understanding. There is the exoteric truth, the simple surface-level teachings meant for the masses, the moral rules and the worship of the Creator God, which keeps the ordinary people docile and bound to the wheel of the world. Then there is the esoteric truth, the secret, inner teaching, the gnosis, which is not for everyone. It is thought that the community which produced this gospel believed that handing the deepest mysteries to the uninitiated was not only pointless, but dangerous. To give the key to the prison to someone who does not even know they are locked up is a waste, and it invites the wrath of the archons who guard the cells. The secret revelation to Judas is the ultimate esoteric gift. It is a truth that shatters the foundation of the world, and it can only be entrusted to a mind strong enough and a spirit clear enough to withstand the shock of its shattering. By drawing Judas into this private celestial revelation, the text connects his story to the broader, sweeping currents of Gnostic enlightenment. In the Gnostic worldview, salvation is not achieved through good works, or through the forgiveness of sins, or through faith in the God of this world. Salvation is achieved through knowledge. It is an awakening, a sudden, dramatic realization of who you truly are, where you came from, and how you became trapped. The vision of the luminous cloud is the moment of Judas's full enlightenment. He sees the true God, and in doing so, he remembers his own true nature as a fragment of that divine light, temporarily entombed in matter. This is the moment the spell of the Demiurge is broken. The cosmic scales fall from his eyes. He no longer sees a world of solid, immutable reality, but a fragile, poorly constructed illusion held together by ignorance and forgetfulness. The secret revelation is the catalyst that transforms Judas from a mere follower into the master of the mystery, the only one capable of finishing the work that the Christ began. Yet this enlightenment is a double-edged sword, a radiance that brings with it a terrible isolating burden. To see the luminous cloud, to possess the gnosis of the true God, is to become profoundly alienated from the world of the living. Judas cannot share what he has seen. The other disciples would not understand it. They would likely attack him for blasphemy. He is now a solitary traveller, holding a truth that sets him entirely apart from the human community around him. He knows that the creator of this world is a fraud, that the physical body is a prison, and that the only path to salvation lies in the destruction of the flesh. He knows that he must hand Jesus over, not as an act of malice, but as the final necessary step in the liberation of the divine spark. The secret revelation does not make his task easier, it makes it unavoidable. Having seen the true light of the supreme realm, how could he possibly leave the Christ trapped in the suffocating darkness of the lower world? The vision seals his fate, binding him to a destiny that will free the divine, but condemn the man. And so, armed with this devastating world-altering knowledge, Judas prepares to step into the garden and into infamy, carrying a secret far older than the stars. And so, having glimpsed the luminous cloud and the unbearable brightness of the true divine realm, we are left to grapple with the most staggering, philosophically vertiginous implication of the text. If the true God is an infinite, unnameable expanse of pure light, utterly removed from the coarse affairs of the physical world, then who exactly made this place? Who fashioned the stone, the wood, the suffocating flesh, and the heavy, choking gravity that binds us to the dust? The answer provided by the Gospel of Judas, and by the broader currents of ancient Gnosticism from which it flows, is as radical as it is disorienting. The creator of our world is not the supreme God. The creator of our world is a lesser, deeply flawed being known as the Demiurge. To understand the Demiurge, you have to imagine a cosmos that is not a harmonious, singular creation, but a kind of cosmic accident, a cascading series of errors and emanations that tumble downward from the heights of pure spirit into the dense, dark basement of matter. In the intricate cosmology of the text, the supreme God, that great invisible spirit, did not shape the earth or mould the mountains. That spirit simply is, resting in perfect eternal stillness. But from the divine expanse, emanations of light radiate outward, like ripples fading as they move further from the stone that disturbed the water. The further these emanations travel from the source, the dimmer they become, the less they remember of the pure light from which they sprang. Eventually, at the very bottom of this long fading cascade, a being emerges who is profoundly ignorant of his own origins. This is the Demiurge. In the Gospel of Judas, he is given a name that echoes through the worn, decaying papyrus, Nebro, which some scholars translate as the rebel or Yaldabaoth, a being of terrifying arrogance and profound tragic blindness. The Demiurge, the text suggests, looks around at the dim, chaotic corners of the lower realms and believes he is entirely alone. Unaware of the luminous heavens stretched far above him, he decides to create a world of his own. He shapes the material cosmos. He separates the waters from the sky. He moulds the mountains and the oceans. And then, in an act of either desperate mimicry or arrogant defiance, he fashions humanity. But he is not a master craftsman. He is a bungler, a fool playing with forces he does not understand. The physical world in this framework is not a masterpiece of divine artistry. It is a crude, poorly constructed imitation of the true immaterial heavens. It is a cosmic error. It is thought by many scholars of Gnosticism that the material realm was conceived of as a prison, a labyrinth of suffering and decay, designed to keep the divine spark trapped in a state of perpetual forgetfulness. The Demiurge is not a loving father. He is a jailer, or perhaps worse, a petulant tyrant, demanding worship and obedience from the very beings he has ensnared. This is a concept that turns the spiritual universe inside out. For mainstream Christian theology, rooted in the Genesis narrative, the material world is fundamentally good. God creates the heavens and the earth, and he looks upon his work and sees that it is good, even very good. The physical body is a temple, the earth is a gift, and the Creator is wholly benevolent, omniscient, and perfectly good. To suggest otherwise was, in the eyes of the early church fathers, not merely a theological disagreement, but a dangerous, soul-threatening heresy. But the Gospel of Judas forces us to look at the world as it is experienced, not as it is ideally imagined. It looks at the droughts that wither the crops, the diseases that take the children, the sheer unrelenting brutality of survival, and it asks a devastating question. If this world was created by a being of perfect goodness and unlimited power, why is it so full of suffering? The Gnostic answer is uncomfortably simple. The world is flawed because the Creator is flawed. The cosmos is broken because the one who built it was working with faulty blueprints, blinded by his own ignorance and pride. Why did this idea prove so philosophically challenging, so explosive that it had to be buried in a cave in the Egyptian desert? Because it dismantles the very foundation of human complacency. If the creator of this world is the highest possible God, then the suffering of the material plane must somehow be justified. It must be part of a grand, benevolent plan too complex for mortal minds to comprehend. But if the creator is a mistake, if the architect of our reality is merely a rebellious, ignorant underling, then our suffering is not part of a divine plan at all. It is a glitch. It is a systemic failure of a badly designed system. This is a deeply radical thought, one that strips away the comfort of a paternal, watchful deity and replaces it with a far more unsettling reality. It means that the very fabric of the physical world, the laws of decay, the inevitability of death, the hunger and the pain, are not features of a loving creation, but the iron bars of a cosmic cage. It implies that salvation cannot possibly come from worshipping the creator of the cage. It can only come from realizing the truth about the cage and finding a way to break out. Yet, as we sit with the ancient ink and the fragile, reassembled pages of the Codex, we must also acknowledge that not all scholars read this devastating vision in the same absolute terms. Alternate readings suggest that the text's portrayal of the Demiurge might be softened by a more nuanced theological lens. Some interpreters argue that the Demiurge is not purely malevolent, but tragically ignorant, a figure who is himself a victim of the cosmic hierarchy, unaware of the divine light above him and acting out of a misguided sense of order rather than pure malice. In this reading, creation is less of a deliberate prison and more of an inevitable consequence of distance from the divine source, a dimming of the light rather than an active rebellion against it. Others dispute the interpretation entirely, suggesting that the Gnostic creator figures are sometimes mythological personifications of the human condition, representing the flawed, ego-driven mind that keeps us trapped in cycles of suffering, rather than a literal, supernatural being. It is thought that some early Gnostic sects may have viewed the Demiurge not as a separate, evil god, but as a lower manifestation of the divine will, a necessary though imperfect stage in the grand unfolding of the cosmos. In these softer readings, the material world is still a place of illusion and forgetfulness, but it is not wholly devoid of the divine presence. It is a shadow, yes, but even a shadow is cast by a light. But whether the Demiurge is understood as a hostile tyrant, a foolish bungler, or a tragic symbol of cosmic ignorance, the core assertion of the Gospel of Judas remains profoundly unsettling. The world you see, the world of solid matter and heavy stone, is not the true world. And the God who claims authority over this world, the one who thunders from the mountaintops and demands sacrifice, is not the highest God. There is something else beyond the crude, painted backdrop of the material cosmos, a realm of pure, untainted light that existed before the flawed architect ever picked up his tools. To accept this is to look at the night sky and see not the ceiling of a comfortable home, but the walls of a vast, cavernous enclosure, with the faint, shimmering hint of the true homeland bleeding through the cracks. And it is to realize that the entire history of the material universe, from the formation of the stars to the rise and fall of human empires, is built upon a foundational cosmic mistake. If the material world is a cosmic accident, a flawed and suffocating prison built by an ignorant architect, then where does the true light come from? What is the nature of that luminous realm, that shimmering expanse of pure spirit, that the Demiurge could neither understand nor recreate? To answer this, the Gospel of Judas draws us upward, out of the dense, heavy basement of matter, and into the vast, silent reaches of the true divine realm. In the intricate cosmology of the text, this realm is not a place you can walk to. It is not located on a map or hidden behind a veil of clouds. It is a state of being, an infinite expanse of pure immaterial light that exists beyond the very concepts of time, space, and form. At the very apex of this radiant void dwells the great invisible spirit, a presence so utterly transcendent that it cannot be named, cannot be pictured, cannot even be fully comprehended by the human mind. The text describes this supreme God not as a king sitting on a throne, but as an unfathomable brightness, a profound and eternal stillness from which all true existence flows. And from this stillness, from the depths of the divine mystery, the first emanation emerges. Scholars of ancient Gnosticism refer to this first emanation as Barbelo. She is often depicted as the Divine Mother, the first thought of the Supreme God, the womb of all creation. But she is not a creator, in the way we typically understand the word. She does not mould clay or shape mountains. Instead, she is the vessel through which the invisible spirit begins to radiate outward, the first ripple of light spreading across the surface of a bottomless, eternal pool. From the union of the invisible spirit and Barbelo, a cascading series of further emanations begins to unfold. These are the aeons, eternal beings of pure light that exist in perfect, harmonious pairs. Some interpretations suggest they are best understood as vast celestial realms in and of themselves, each one a distinct dimension of divine consciousness, simultaneously a being and a place. Together these aeons form what the ancient texts call the pleroma, a Greek word that means fullness or completeness. The pleroma is the true divine realm. It is a layered, intricate structure of light, a labyrinth of radiant spirits where nothing is lacking, nothing decays, and nothing is ever forgotten. Every aeon reflects the glory of the invisible spirit, just as the light of a candle is reflected and magnified by a hall of mirrors, each reflection perfect, each flame passing into the next without ever diminishing the original fire. It is thought that these ideas were not born in a vacuum, but rather emerged from a rich, syncretic blend of Platonic philosophy and Jewish mysticism. In the philosophy of Plato, there is the concept of the realm of forms, an immaterial plane where the perfect, eternal templates of all things exist, far beyond the imperfect, decaying shadows we see in the material world. The Gnostic pleroma is deeply indebted to this vision. The material world of the Demiurge is merely a corrupted copy, a cheap forgery of the true immaterial forms that reside in the divine fullness. But the text also draws heavily on Jewish mystical traditions, particularly the concept of a supreme, hidden God who is utterly distinct from the more active, manifest deity who interacts with the world. In some strands of ancient Jewish apocalyptic literature, there are descriptions of multiple heavens, of angelic hierarchies, and of a divine chariot throne that the mystic must ascend through perilous guarded gates. The Gospel of Judas takes these older frameworks and reimagines them on a breathtakingly grand scale, transforming the heavens into an infinite succession of aeons, and replacing the fearsome guarding angels with beings of pure benevolent light. The contrast between this divine pleroma and the material realm could not be more absolute. Down below in the world fashioned by the Demiurge, everything is heavy, everything decays. Time devours all things, stone erodes into sand, flesh sickens and rots, and the heavy, suffocating gravity of matter drags everything down into the dark. But up above, in the true divine realm, there is no decay. There is no hunger, no pain, no death. The aeons do not age. They do not suffer. They exist in a state of perpetual, unchanging radiance, bathed in the continuous outpouring of the invisible spirit. It is a vision of existence that is almost impossible for the human mind to grasp, precisely because our minds have been shaped by the crude, broken rules of the Demiurge's world. We know only separation, loss, and the slow, grinding deterioration of all things. The pleroma, by contrast, is a realm of absolute unity and eternal wholeness. For the ancient readers of the Gospel of Judas, this was not merely an abstract philosophical daydream. It was a profound and deeply personal promise. Hidden within the heavy, suffocating flesh of the human body, trapped inside the very prison the Demiurge had constructed, there exists a fragment of the divine, a tiny spark of the pleroma. This is the divine spark, a sliver of pure light that remembers, however faintly, the true homeland from which it fell. The material world constantly seeks to smother this spark, burying it under the weight of physical desire, social obligation, and the worship of the false creator. But the spark survives, smouldering in the dark, waiting to be fanned back into a flame. And the only way to awaken it, the only way to break the spell of the Demiurge, is through hidden knowledge. The Gnostic salvation is not achieved by obeying the laws of the Creator, or by offering sacrifices in his temple. It is achieved by remembering, by coming to understand the true structure of the cosmos, by realizing that the God of this world is a fraud, and by awakening to the divine origin of the soul. The trapped spark begins to rise, shedding the heavy, suffocating garments of the material world as it ascends back through the celestial spheres. This offered a radically different meaning to salvation. In mainstream Christian theology, salvation is ultimately a rescue operation. A fallen, sinful humanity is saved by the grace and sacrifice of the true Creator, who will one day redeem and restore the material world, resurrecting the dead into perfected physical bodies. But the Gnostic vision offers no such comfort regarding the physical. In the world of the Gospel of Judas, the material cosmos is not waiting to be redeemed. It is waiting to be escaped. Salvation is not the healing of the body, but the liberation of the spirit from the body entirely. It is the long, perilous journey of the divine spark as it climbs back through the layers of the cosmos, slipping past the archons, the demonic sentinels who guard the lower heavens, striving to return to the limitless light of the pleroma, to be swallowed up once more in the great invisible spirit. It is a vision of homecoming, a return to a realm that was never meant to be left, an escape from the grand, tragic mistake of creation back into the arms of the true, silent, eternal God. If the divine spark is trapped, smouldering in the dark, waiting to be fanned back into a flame, then the most urgent question becomes, how does the spark escape? How does a fragment of the infinite pleroma buried beneath layers of heavy, suffocating flesh and the ceaseless noise of the Demiurge's broken world find its way back to the silent, eternal light? For the ancient readers of the Gospel of Judas, the answer was not found in piety, as the wider world understood it. It was not found in obeisance to the laws of the false creator, or in the hopeful waiting for a bodily resurrection. It was found in a single shattering act of liberation. And this is where the text performs its most staggering, its most radical inversion of the traditional story. In this buried Codex, Judas Iscariot is not the betrayer who condemns the Son of God to a brutal death. He is the chosen disciple who sets the divine spark free. To understand this, we have to look at the body through the eyes of the ancient Gnostics. In the traditional theology that would eventually dominate the Western world, the human body is sacred. It is a temple, a vessel fashioned by a loving Creator, destined for glory and resurrection. The flesh is inherently good, and its ultimate fate is to be transfigured, healed, and made eternal. But the Gospel of Judas draws a sharp, cold blade across that idea. In the dim, starlit world of this text, the physical body is not a temple. It is a prison cell. It is a cage of bone and blood, of nerve and sinew, constructed by the ignorant archons to keep the divine spark tethered to the realm of decay. Every hunger pang, every thirst, every ache of aging and sickness is a feature of the cage, a mechanism designed to anchor the immaterial soul to the heavy, suffocating gravity of matter. The body does not protect the spirit, it entombs it. And so, in this framework, the crucifixion of Jesus is not a tragic miscarriage of justice, nor is it primarily a sacrifice meant to atone for the sins of the world. Some interpretations suggest that within Gnostic thought, the cross becomes an instrument of release, a dark and painful doorway through which the imprisoned spirit finally escapes its cage of flesh. When the nails are driven in and the breath leaves the body, it is not a moment of ultimate defeat. It is the moment of ultimate liberation. The heavy garments of the material world are sloughed off at last. The divine spark, freed from its agonizing confinement, begins its long ascent back through the celestial spheres, slipping past the demonic sentinels who guard the lower heavens, returning to the limitless light of the pleroma from which it fell. But for this liberation to occur, someone had to initiate the process. Someone had to hand Jesus over to the Roman authorities to trigger the sequence of events that would shatter the physical cage. In the traditional narrative, Judas does this out of greed or jealousy, or the dark promptings of Satan. His act is the ultimate sin, the most infamous betrayal in human history. But the Gospel of Judas turns this completely inside out. In this text, Jesus pulls Judas aside and reveals to him the great cosmic secret. He tells Judas that he will exceed all the other disciples because it is Judas who will perform the final necessary task. Judas is not betraying the Christ to his death, he is helping him to shed his mortal shell. By handing Jesus over, Judas is acting as the catalyst for the Spirit's release. He is not the villain of the story, he is the only one who truly understands what must be done. He is the liberator of the divine spark. This reframing of the crucifixion creates a profound philosophical tension that lies at the very heart of the text. It is a tension between the flesh and the spirit, between the visible world of suffering and the invisible realm of peace. In the traditional atonement theology that would later define Orthodox Christianity, the crucifixion is a transaction. The perfect, sinless Son of God dies as a substitute for a corrupt humanity, taking the punishment that humanity deserves, and thereby reconciling the world to the Creator. The material world is stained by sin, but it can be washed clean by the blood of the sacrifice. The body is still a vessel of potential redemption. But the Gospel of Judas offers no such comfort regarding the physical. There is no transaction here, no reconciliation with the Creator of this world. The Demiurge is not a loving father waiting to forgive. He is an ignorant tyrant, and his creation is a mistake. The crucifixion does not redeem the flesh. It abandons it. It is not a negotiation with the archons. It is a prison break. This is the breathtaking divergence that makes the Gospel of Judas so deeply unsettling to traditional theology, and so profoundly fascinating to those who encounter it today. It asks us to imagine that everything we have been taught about sin, sacrifice, and salvation might be seen from an entirely different angle. It asks us to consider that the most reviled figure in the Christian story might actually be the hero, the only one with the courage to help the divine break free from its agonizing entanglement with matter. It is a vision that strips away the comfortable certainty of a redeemed physical world and replaces it with a stark, beautiful call to awaken, to remember the true homeland, to seek the destruction of the cage and the liberation of the spark. But such a radical vision could not go unanswered. As the faint traces of ancient ink on crumbling papyrus continued to reveal their secrets, it became clear that the Gospel of Judas was not merely an alternate perspective. It was a direct, unapologetic challenge to the very foundations of the emerging Orthodox Church. And the Church Fathers were more than ready to strike back. Enter Irenaeus, the Bishop of Lyon, writing in the late 2nd century, a time when the Christian movement was still a vast, swirling ocean of competing ideas, fragmented texts and wildly divergent interpretations. Irenaeus was not a man who viewed this theological diversity as a rich tapestry to be celebrated. He saw it as a creeping existential threat across the sprawling Roman Empire in the sun-drenched cities of Alexandria, the bustling ports of Ephesus, and the quiet desert communities of Upper Egypt. Different groups were reading different Gospels, telling different stories about the nature of God, the creation of the world, and the true meaning of Christ's death. For Irenaeus, this was not merely a matter of intellectual disagreement, it was a matter of spiritual life and death. He believed there was one truth, one unified message handed down from the apostles, and anything that deviated from that single narrow path was a dangerous distortion. In approximately the year 180, Irenaeus composed a massive, sprawling 5-volume work titled Against Heresies. It was a systematic, relentless, and often withering attack on the various forms of Gnostic Christianity that were flourishing at the time. He dissected their cosmologies with the precision of a surgeon, mocked their elaborate hierarchies of divine beings, and sought to expose what he saw as the fundamental absurdity of their claims. But what is truly staggering for modern readers is how specifically he targeted the very text we are discussing. In the very first book of Against Heresies, Irenaeus writes about a group he calls the Cainites, a Gnostic sect who, he claims, regard Judas Iscariot not as a traitor but as a hero. And then he drops a detail that sends a chill down the spine of any historian. He writes that these Cainites produce a fictitious history of this kind, which they style the Gospel of Judas. Read that again. In the late 2nd century, Irenaeus of Lyon is explicitly naming a Gospel of Judas, and he is condemning it. For centuries, scholars reading Irenaeus had no idea if this Gospel of Judas was a real text or just a rhetorical bogeyman, a convenient fiction invented by heresy hunters to make their opponents sound more outrageous. But when the Codex emerged from the Egyptian desert in the 20th century, when the crumbling papyrus was finally unrolled and the ancient Coptic script deciphered, it was as if Irenaeus's ghost had reached across 18 centuries to confirm its existence. The text he was attacking was real. The ideas he was trying to suppress had actually been committed to ink and papyrus, read by real people in real communities, passed hand to hand in the flickering lamplight of hidden gatherings. But why did Irenaeus and the other church fathers fight so hard against this text and others like it? The answer goes far beyond simple theological disagreement. The political and theological stakes were enormous. In the 2nd and 3rd centuries, there was no central authority, no single institution that could definitively say what Christians were supposed to believe. The movement was decentralized, localized, and incredibly diverse. Different communities had different texts, different rituals, and different understandings of who Jesus was. Some saw him as a purely divine being who only appeared to have a physical body. Others saw him as a human being who was adopted by God at his baptism. And others, like the readers of the Gospel of Judas, saw the material world itself as a catastrophic error. For leaders like Irenaeus, this diversity was not just confusing, it was fatal. If the Christian message was fragmented into 100 different and contradictory teachings, then how could it possibly survive in a hostile world dominated by the Roman Empire and its pagan cults? How could it offer a coherent alternative to the surrounding culture if its own adherents could not agree on the most basic questions about God and creation? And so Irenaeus and his allies set out to define the boundaries of acceptable belief. They argued for a single unified canon of Scripture, 4 Gospels, no more, no less reflecting the 4 corners of the earth and the 4 winds. They argued for a single unbroken chain of authority, stretching back to the original apostles, a chain that ran through the bishops who were their successors, and they argued that any text, any teaching, any interpretation that fell outside these boundaries was not merely wrong, it was heresy, a dangerous poison that would destroy the soul. The suppression of condemned texts was not always a dramatic affair of bonfires and armed raids, though there were certainly moments of violence and destruction. More often it was a quieter, more insidious process. Texts that were deemed heretical were simply not copied. In a world where every manuscript had to be laboriously reproduced by hand, the most effective way to eliminate a text was to ensure that no new copies were made. Scribes working under the direction of Orthodox bishops would not waste precious papyrus and expensive ink on texts that the Church had condemned. Over time, as the older copies wore out, were damaged by moisture, were eaten by insects, or simply crumbled into dust. The texts they contained would vanish from the world. The words would die with the medium that carried them. Other texts were actively destroyed, fed to flames in a deliberate effort to erase them from memory. And some were simply forgotten, tucked away in dusty corners of monastic libraries, unread and uncopied, slowly deteriorating until even the memory of their existence faded. The role of church councils in this process cannot be overstated. Over the centuries, as the Orthodox position solidified and the institutional church grew in power, councils of bishops would gather to define doctrine, to pronounce anathemas on those who taught contrary to the accepted faith, and to formally close the canon of Scripture. These councils, with the weight of imperial authority behind them in later centuries, drew a sharp, uncompromising line between the texts that were sacred and the texts that were dangerous. The texts that fell on the wrong side of that line were cut off from the life of the Church. They were not to be read, not to be discussed, not to be preserved. They were anathema, and so the Gospel of Judas, with its staggering claim that creation was a mistake and its radical rehabilitation of the ultimate betrayer, was pushed to the margins, and then beyond the margins into the outer darkness of historical oblivion. It is not hard to imagine why the Codex vanished for over 1,000 years. In a world where the Orthodox narrative held sway, where the 4 canonical Gospels were copied and recopied in gleaming scriptoriums, their words illuminated with gold and precious pigments, the Gospel of Judas was a dangerous relic of a suppressed tradition. To possess it was to risk accusation of heresy. To read it was to risk spiritual contamination. And so, at some point, perhaps in the 4th or 5th century, as the institutional church tightened its grip, and the old Gnostic communities dwindled and disappeared, someone, a monk, a priest, or a lay believer, made the decision to hide it. Perhaps they placed it in a clay jar, hoping that the dry desert air would preserve it, hoping that someday, in a distant future they could not imagine, someone would find it and read it again. Perhaps they wanted to save it from the flames. Perhaps they believed that the truth it contained, however dangerous, however heretical, should not be allowed to die completely. And so it was buried, deep in the sand, in a cave in the Egyptian desert, where the wind howled and the centuries passed, and the world above forgot all about the text that dared to say that Judas was not the villain, but the hero. That creation was not a divine masterpiece, but a cosmic mistake. That the true God was not the jealous creator of this world, but a silent, infinite light waiting far beyond the stars. When the Gospel of Judas was finally unveiled to the world in 2006 by the National Geographic Society, it was presented as a seismic shock to the foundations of Christian history. The crumbling papyrus, its dark ink barely clinging to the fibres, seemed to speak with astonishing clarity. Here was Judas, not as the embodiment of treachery, but as the favoured disciple, the only one who truly understood the mission of Jesus. The translation released to the public told a story in which Jesus asks Judas to hand him over, elevating him above all the other apostles and entrusting him with the ultimate secret. It was a stunning cinematic narrative, tailor-made for headlines and global fascination. But as the initial excitement settled, a far more complicated, far more contentious story began to emerge from the shadows of the academic world. It turned out that reading a fragmented ancient text is not like reading a modern book. It is more like trying to hear a whisper across a vast, howling desert. At the heart of the modern controversy lies a single Coptic word, a word that would ignite a fierce debate among the world's leading scholars and call into question the very essence of the Gospel's message. The word is daimon. In the original National Geographic translation, this word was rendered as spirit. In the pivotal scene of the text, Jesus turns to Judas and says, in this translation, "You will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me." But a few lines earlier, Jesus also calls Judas the 13th spirit. Rendered this way, the text seems to clearly position Judas as a lofty, elevated, celestial being, a spiritual hero uniquely privy to the divine mystery. The 13th spirit, set apart from the other 12 apostles who remain mired in ignorance and the worship of the false creator. But not everyone was convinced. Enter April Deconic, a scholar of early Christian literature and a professor at Rice University. When Deconic sat down with the Coptic text, examining the ancient script letter by letter, the faded ink on the damaged papyrus, she saw something fundamentally different. She argued that the word daimon in this context should not be translated as spirit at all. In the linguistic world of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, a world steeped in Greek and Coptic cosmological hierarchies, the word typically carried a much darker connotation. It meant demon. Deconic pointed out that throughout the Gospel of Judas, the text uses entirely different words when it wants to convey a positive, divine, spiritual entity. When the text refers to the holy, transcendent beings of the divine realm, it uses the word pneuma, which genuinely means spirit. Daimon, however, was a term often reserved for lesser, malevolent, or deceptive supernatural forces, beings aligned with the lower material world, the world of the Demiurge. The implications of this single word choice are staggering. If Deconic is right, then Jesus is not calling Judas the 13th spirit. He is calling him the 13th demon. The text is not elevating Judas to the status of a divine hero, it is condemning him. In this reading, the Gospel of Judas does not rehabilitate the betrayer at all. Instead, it presents him as the ultimate agent of the false creator, the Saklas, the Demiurge who fashioned the flawed material world. Judas, as the 13th demon, becomes the spiritual adversary who ensures that Jesus is trapped in the physical body, delivering him over to the authorities of the lower heavens to be killed. The sacrifice of the man who clothes Jesus becomes not an act of liberation, but a demonic act of imprisonment, ensuring that the divine spark remains entangled in the catastrophic error of the material realm. The dispute over this translation has fractured the scholarly community and created two wildly divergent versions of the Gospel's core message. On one side are the translators who initially presented Judas as the enlightened hero, a radical subversion of the orthodox tradition. On the other are scholars like Deconic, who argue that the text is actually far more in line with other ancient Gnostic polemics, texts that routinely vilified the apostles who founded the Orthodox Church as servants of the false creator. In this darker reading, the Gospel of Judas is not a redemption of Judas, it is an aggressive, mocking attack on the emerging Orthodox Church, portraying its foundational figures as literal demons leading humanity astray. But how could such a fundamental misunderstanding, or at least such a profound disagreement, occur in the first place? The answer lies in the harrowing physical condition of the Codex itself. Translating an ancient text is never a simple matter of swapping one word for another. It is an intricate dance between linguistics, context, and educated guesswork. And when the text in question has spent over 1,000 years buried in the Egyptian desert, that dance becomes extraordinarily treacherous. The papyrus of the Gospel of Judas is catastrophically damaged. In many places the surface has flaked away entirely, leaving only the ghost of an impression where the scribe's reed pen once pressed. Entire lines are missing, vanished into the dust. In other sections the ink has bled and blurred, making individual letters ambiguous. Was that faded stroke the tail of a Coptic mu, or the curve of an epsilon? A single misread letter can change the meaning of a word, and a single misunderstood word can alter the theology of an entire passage. Translators are often forced to reconstruct missing words based on context, filling in the blanks of sentences where only a few scattered fragments survive. They must weigh the syntax, the theological vocabulary of the period, and the broader literary conventions of Gnostic literature. But the Gnostic landscape was vast and varied, with different sects using the same words in radically different ways. A term that meant something divine and positive in one community could mean something malignant and demonic in another. When you are holding a crumbling scrap of papyrus, trying to read the thoughts of someone who lived 18 centuries ago in a community you can only dimly reconstruct, certainty is a luxury you simply do not have. This ongoing scholarly disagreement means that the true meaning of the Gospel of Judas remains profoundly uncertain. The text has not settled the ancient debates, it has reignited them. Every few years, a new translation or a fresh analysis emerges from the quiet halls of academia, offering a different reading of a damaged line or a controversial phrase. Some scholars have pushed back against Iconic, defending the original Spirit translation and arguing that the Gospel's internal logic demands a more sympathetic reading of Judas. Others have proposed middle grounds, suggesting that the text is intentionally ambiguous, deliberately playing with the double meanings of words to provoke and challenge its readers. The ink on the papyrus is fixed, but the meaning of those ink strokes continues to shift and evolve. This is the nature of studying the ancient world. We so often crave a definitive answer, a clear window into the past, a solid fact to anchor our understanding. But the past is rarely so cooperative. It comes to us in fragments, in broken pieces, in whispers that can be heard in multiple ways. The Gospel of Judas is not a sealed testament delivering a final, unambiguous truth. It is an open wound, a text that continues to resist our attempts to pin it down. The scholars who study it are not just reading a manuscript, they are arguing with it, wrestling with its damaged words, and through that struggle keeping the ancient conversation alive. Interpretation, it turns out, is not a static destination. It is an endless, evolving journey, one that stretches back into the desert darkness and forward into the unknown, carried onward by the simple, fragile act of trying to understand a few words written on decaying papyrus so very long ago. But the Gospel of Judas does not speak in isolation. Its voice, emerging from that damaged, fading papyrus, is part of a vast whispered chorus, a network of forgotten texts that echo the same strange and subversive ideas across the centuries. To truly understand what the Gospel of Judas is saying, we have to listen to those other voices, the ones that were buried alongside it, the ones that the Orthodox Church tried so desperately to silence. And when we do, we begin to see that the vision of creation as a cosmic mistake and the promise of a secret path beyond it was not the invention of a single radical sect. It was a widespread, deeply rooted tradition that ran like a hidden river beneath the surface of early Christianity. Consider the Gospel of Thomas, discovered a half-century before the Judas Codex, buried in the sands of Nag Hammadi. Thomas is perhaps the most famous of the lost Gospels. It contains no narrative at all, no crucifixion, no resurrection, no story of a betrayer. Instead, it is simply a collection of 114 secret sayings attributed to Jesus, hidden words meant not for the masses, but for those with ears to hear. Whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death, the text promises in its very first line. The kingdom of God, Jesus says repeatedly in Thomas, is not a place up in the sky or beyond the sea. It is already here, spread out upon the earth, and people simply do not see it. The path to salvation is not through the blood of sacrifice, but through a radical inward awakening, a stripping away of the illusions of the material world to recover the divine light within. This is the same essential architecture of thought we find in Judas. The material world is not the creation of the true God. It is a place of blindness and forgetting, and the mission of the revealer is not to die for sins, but to wake the sleeper up. Then there is the Gospel of Philip, another text preserved in the Nag Hammadi library, a sprawling poetic work of mystical theology and sacramental symbolism. Philip speaks of the world as a living dream, a phantom constructed by lesser powers. It uses imagery that is startling in its intimacy and its strangeness. It speaks of the soul as a precious thing that came down into the world, and of Christ as the one who came to repair the separation, to reunite what had been broken. In Philip, salvation is not a legal transaction, a debt paid to an angry judge. It is a mystical union, a reintegration of the fragmented self. The text describes sacraments not as rituals of obedience, but as transformative acts that dissolve the boundaries of the flesh and awaken the divine spark. The language is dense, symbolic, often deliberately obscure, designed to conceal its meaning from the uninitiated. But its core vision is unmistakably familiar. The world as we experience it is not the true world. There is a higher reality, a divine fullness, and the path to it lies through secret knowledge, not through the ordinary channels of religious authority. The Nag Hammadi library itself, that miraculous collection of 13 leather-bound papyrus codexes, found by chance by a farmer digging for fertilizer in 1945, is the primary reason we know any of this today. Before its discovery, Gnosticism was largely a phantom, known only through the angry descriptions of its enemies. The Church Fathers had painted the Gnostics as heretics, as corrupters of the truth, as peddlers of absurd and blasphemous myths. But the dried papyrus pages pulled from that Egyptian jar told a different story. They revealed a rich, diverse, and intellectually sophisticated tradition, one that had been systematically suppressed, but had somehow survived in the dark. The dry desert air, the sealed earthenware vessel, had preserved these texts for over 1600 years, texts that included not only Gospels but also apocalypses, prayers, and philosophical treatises, all united by a common thread. They shared a conviction that the material world was flawed, that its creator was not the ultimate God, and that salvation came through revelation, through the direct personal apprehension of a truth that the ordinary world could not provide. Across all of these suppressed texts, the same motifs recur with striking persistence. A world created in error, a divine spark trapped in matter, a revealer who comes from above to awaken the sleeper. Secret knowledge as the key to liberation, the orthodox religious establishment as the unwitting or even willing servants of the false creator. These are not random variations. They are the signatures of a coherent and deeply felt spiritual vision, one that flourished in the shadows of the Roman Empire and offered a radically different answer to the problem of human suffering. The parallels suggest a broad hidden Christian tradition, a vast and branching river of thought that flowed alongside, and often against, the stream that would eventually become the Orthodox Church. But even with the extraordinary survival of the Nag Hammadi library and the later discovery of the Gospel of Judas, we are almost certainly seeing only a fraction of what once existed. The dry Egyptian desert has preserved these texts against all odds, but how many others were buried in places where the sand could not protect them? How many were deliberately destroyed, burned by those who considered them dangerous, shredded and scattered on the wind? How many more jars lie hidden beneath the dunes, waiting for the right combination of chance and discovery to bring them back to light? The ancient world was full of texts we will never read, full of voices we will never hear. Every fragment that survives is a minor miracle, a threadbare bridge across a vast chasm of silence. And in that silence the mystery only deepens. We are left to wonder what other visions of the divine were lost to time. What other understandings of creation and salvation were buried and forgotten? What other gospels still lie hidden in the earth, holding their secrets in the dark? So we are left with this, a damaged codex, its pages fractured and fading, that has travelled an almost impossible path from the darkness of an Egyptian cave to the glaring light of modern headlines. It was pulled from the sand, passed through the shadowy corridors of the black market, left to crumble in a bank vault, and finally, painstakingly pieced back together by scholars wielding infrared lights and endless patience. The journey of this ancient manuscript is, in itself, a kind of miracle of survival, a fragile thread of papyrus and ink that refuse to be erased by time or neglect. And as we sit with this text in the quiet of the night, we return to its most haunting question. Did the people who wrote and read this gospel truly believe that creation itself was a mistake? That the vast, starry expanse above us and the solid ground beneath us were the products of a flawed and ignorant architect? Some interpretations suggest exactly that. The Codex presents a cosmos where the material realm is a prison of suffering, crafted by a lesser being who revels in blind obedience. It is a chilling vision, a universe where the very fabric of reality is fundamentally compromised. But perhaps it is also a deeply human response to the problem of pain. If the world is broken, if disease and disaster and cruelty seem to rule the day, then maybe the idea that creation itself is flawed offers a strange, paradoxical comfort. It means that the true divine realm, the realm of the spirit, remains pure, untouched by the chaos down here. And then there is Judas, reimagined not as the embodiment of treachery, but as the singular disciple who understood the deepest, most painful truth. His role in this codex reveals something profound about the early centuries of Christianity, a period we often imagine as unified and straightforward, but which was, in reality, a swirling, turbulent sea of competing ideas. The Gospel of Judas stands as undeniable evidence that early Christian communities were asking radically different questions about the nature of God, the purpose of suffering, and the path to salvation. There was no single monolithic faith, but a rich, disputatious diversity, a canopy of thought under which many different branches grew. Of course, the Codex does not offer easy answers. The scholarly debates remain as tangled and unresolved as the fragmented pages themselves. Experts still disagree on the precise translation of key passages, on whether Judas is truly exalted or ultimately condemned within the text's own strange logic, on the exact nature of the luminous cloud that appears in its final lines. The manuscript is full of lacunae, those maddening blank spaces where the papyrus has simply turned to dust, leaving us to guess at the words that once filled them. In a way, these gaps are fitting. The text resists being pinned down. It retains its mystery, demanding that we sit in the discomfort of uncertainty, that we listen to the silence as much as the words. And that, perhaps, is what the buried Codex ultimately leaves us with. A reminder that the past is never truly settled. Ancient hidden texts, pulled from the earth after centuries of silence, still have the power to unsettle us, to make us rethink what we thought we knew, to shape modern questions of faith and meaning. They whisper to us across the millennia, telling us that the search for the divine has never been a simple road, that the cosmos is stranger and more layered than we can easily comprehend. As you drift towards sleep tonight, let the image of that ancient codex rest softly in your mind, its fractured pages glowing faintly in the dark, holding secrets that we may never fully unravel. If this journey through the sands of time and the mysteries of ancient faith has brought you some peace or wonder tonight, I would be so grateful if you would take a moment to like this video, leave a comment and subscribe. I always love hearing where you are listening from, whether you are tucked away in a quiet apartment in the city or lying beneath a vast starlit sky somewhere far away. And if you would like to support this channel and help bring more of these slow, meditative histories into the world, the very best way is to follow the show on Spotify. The link is waiting for you in the description below. Until next time, sleep well and let the ancient silence hold you.